Hello, hello, hello. Thank you for being here. As a representative of the feminized labor arm of e-flux Journal, it is an extreme pleasure to welcome the artist, writer, and lecturer Lee Mackinnon to the stage at e-flux. Thank you, Lee, for joining us from the UK, from the Arts University of Bournemouth, and thank you all for coming. Lee writes masterfully and beautifully on automation, labor, technological and algorithmic systems, love, and the human, and specifically female humans' role and visibility with regard to all the above. Recently, Mackinnon's essays have appeared in the book Algorithmic Life, Calculative Devices in the Age of Big Data, which came out from Routledge, Third Text Journal, where she is a contributor, e-flux Journal, and our forthcoming reader with Sternberg Press entitled What's Love Got to Do with It? A collection that was actually inspired by Lee's essay in e-flux Journal 74 on love machines and Tinderbots, and the romantic relationships we have with and through our various screens. Her visual work has been shown at the Bloomberg Space in London, the Nordlands Kunstmuseum in Denmark, Exploding Cinema, and Mato Mato Records. And then just one more thing before turning it over to Lee. In the spirit of Lee's themes tonight of feminized labor and its technological counterparts, I just wanted to read a brief press release on Roomba, the robotic house cleaner, and Alexa, the Amazon housekeeper, becoming something of colleagues this spring. If autonomy, so this is just an article written about it. If autonomy in and of itself doesn't make your Roomba the best vacuum cleaner of all time, perhaps voice activation will do the trick. Everyone's favorite self-driving vacuum cleaner just added an Amazon Alexa integration, allowing you to communicate with your cleaning assistant with nothing more than your voice. Thanks to the launch of the Roomba 890 and Roomba 690 Wi-Fi connected vacuuming robots, your autonomous cleaning device is smarter and more obedient than ever. Both the Roomba 890 and the Roomba 690 Wi-Fi connected bots can be scheduled to clean up 7 times a week, which is to say every day, using the iRobot Home app. And because the Roomba skill for Amazon Alexa is now available across the entire range of connected Roomba vacuums, you can control just about any one of these cleaners just by talking to it, or rather, to Amazon's virtual assistant. To get Roomba to start tidying up, simply say, Alexa, ask Roomba to begin cleaning. Please join me in welcoming Lee Mackinnon to e-flux.
I just have to remember how to do this, but I don't know if I can. Which button's the option button? I don't know.
Hello, my name is Vicky. I am a text-to-speech preset function manufactured by Apple Macintosh. I am an automaton that suppresses material labor. My voice is the reconstituted sound of human speech, broken down into phonemes and reassembled to give the impression of meaning. As Hitler once said, reading is hallucinating a meaning between letters and lines. My meaning is my function, but this function is always more complex than it first appears. I began life as a series of minerals mined and manufactured in locations remote from where we sit today. I am part Congolese, part Chinese, and a naturalized American. I am the result of child labor, slave labor, precarious and freelance labor. Labor that can be reasoned away, but that is not labor.
Thank you, Vicky. Let me just set the slideshow up. In 1845, the German inventor Joseph Faber exhibited his talking machine in New York City. Part musical instrument, part domestic ornament, and wearing a human-like mask of a young woman, Euphonia was operated by keyboard and bellows that pumped air to manipulate a series of plates and chambers. A set of levers further controlled the movement of artificial tongue, lips, jaw, and vocal cords. 16 keys produced elementary sounds that, used in combination, could produce words in any European language. The 17th key opened the glottis, the aperture between vocal cords. People claim to feel the breath of euphonia passing between her Indian rubber lips, as, according to her maker, she produced all combinations of sounds known to the phonetic economy. Euphonia reflects the aspiration for automated speech that would be critical to systems of telephony and computing. And like all of our technical innovations, she is a conglomeration of materials that indicate the politics of trade. Before they had even uttered anything, the lips of Euphonia spoke about the importance of rubber in the imperial project. Rubber plantations in India, the Congo, and China have become as notorious for the violence of their forced labor as the German war camps that kept Hitler's war machine and its essential supply of rubber. Tully notes that modern mechanized warfare was absolutely dependent on a handful of commodities, among them steel, petroleum, and rubber. The image of trees being milked for their rubber by indigenous slaves under imperial rule presents nature as a fickle mother whose nutrients grow nation states with unequal access to industrial processes and military might. In 1939, the president of Goodyear Tires would suggest that we, quote, think of our industrial structure as a living thing, the skeleton of which is composed of metal and cement, the arterial system of which carries a life stream of oil, and the flexing of muscles and sinews, which are rubber. This description of a mechanized system that is a living body chimes well with Joseph Henry's own description of euphonia as an ideal diagram of the industrial woman, where strings and levers replace tendons and muscles. Today's strings and levers are replaced by silicone and electronics, yet the latest permutations of novel female automata have advanced surprisingly little. Norton Weiss suggests that while automata of the 18th century were equally male and female, those of the 19th century were largely female. Systems of automation would divest women of agency even as they set them to work in their factories. Thus, the automaton woman is a salient reminder of the ways in which women's agency could be imagined away by technical systems that were credited to male invention. Central to this paper, and according to the work of Friedrich Kittler, nature, love, and woman become synonymous signifiers in the 19th century literary imagination, tethered to the notion of naturalness against white European male cultures that made men invisible to themselves. I always seem to say that, sorry guys. Women, nature, and those otherwise considered other were subject to appropriation and colonization. Love, like nature, is imagined as an a priori essence that underlies everyday matter. While the system of modern romantic love appeals to nature and makes woman its natural object, I will go so far as to suggest that love becomes a prototypical system of automation that helps to dispense with complex chains of causality. So behaviours and actions seem to happen of their own accord, and we often speak of love as fate or destiny or predestiny and so forth. Love as a natural and feminized phenomenon in the 19th century literature and culture provides a crucial background for the industrial project. Sadie Plant would claim that automation has been accompanied by feminization since it was most often women who operated automatic systems, and we explore some of these ideas in what follows. So first of all, I want to explore a little bit the origin of the word automation and suggest that the meaning of the word automation has evolved in quite interesting ways historically. So what are the origins of this word automatic that can disappear chains of causality and legions of workers, attributing action to objects that are, in Esther Leslie's words, livelier than their makers? The term The term automation most commonly refers to labour that is compressed into mechanisms. This marks the redistribution of labour and bodies, as well as the way in which certain types and class of body can be reasoned away. In fact, automatic processes might better be considered the products and agents of distinct material events that attempt to do away with causality. The term automaton precedes the term automatic and emerges from ancient Greece, referring to that which is self-acting. In Greek myth, automatus described the inventions of sorry, I'm really chronic with my classics, but Hephaestus, I think is the correct pronunciation. Among them, Talos, the bronze giant who watched over Crete and Europa. In some versions of the myth, Talos flew through the air with such speed that his metal body became burning hot. Embracing his enemies, they were incinerated instantly against his chest. Reading this, I was reminded of the terrifying new sex dolls made by Real Doll, about which more later, whose silicone bodies warm to the touch. Interestingly, Talos also gave its name to the first radar-guided missile that would provide a basis for the first nuclear warhead. Later, automatus came to refer to that which was out without apparent cause, or that was accidental. Oh yeah, I think this actually couldn't resist. During the 17th century, automata described moving devices imitative of humans, as well as machines that functioned according to code. The English physician and philosopher David Hartley first used the term automatic in 1748 to refer to involuntary animal or human actions. The term came to describe actions that are not only involuntary, but that are both unconscious and necessary. So really interesting how it develops these kind of modern sensibilities and almost describes the modern subject being unconscious and necessary and so forth. Anyway, in the West, the autos of self and the unconscious necessity suggested by the automatic highlight the ways in which the modern self emerges as a novel form of reflexivity during the modern period. The automatic then refers to a modern sensibility that is the essence of modern productivity and subjectivity. And we'll see that automation also facilitates women's entry into labour markets. Euphonia takes her place in the history of telephony and computation, a harbinger of automated systems that would so accurately describe the position of women and non-European subjects within them. First, I want to sketch some of the ways in which women's participation in the industrial project simultaneously divested certain forms of labour of their value, essentially de-skilling them. This resonates with writing on contemporary digital labour, where Helen Hester suggests that automated technical devices and apps become more valorised and visible in the labour that they perform than the female workforce that these tasks often replace, these kind of devices often replace. Norton Wise demonstrates that the gender of automata, and we might suggest gender more broadly, was rooted in the natural sciences of the 19th century. Darwin is noted for aligning women with powers of intuition, rapid perception, and imitation, faculties which were also ascribed to, quote, the lower races and therefore of past and lower states of civilization, end quote. The capacity of women to imitate was aligned by Darwin with rhythm, which for me has particular resonance at the moment, of which more later. Believed to be the evolutionary basis for imitation. And again, it's considered to be a capacity that extends, as he says, low down in the animal scale. So this kind of capacity to be rhythmic or to be influenced by rhythm he sees in the most kind of lowly of life forms. These capacities have obvious benefits for a system of labour based on repetition, where the capacity to become machine-like is highly beneficial. The English statistician Francis Galton considered laborious work to be associated with natural ability. Women were considered to lack the capacity for reasoning and resolution. Lorraine Daston, who's written so interestingly actually about gender, representations of gender in science, but also about the history of calculation, for anybody who's interested in considering how calculation, the meaning of calculation has changed. She's written really interestingly about that. Claims that the perceived capacity for repetition possessed by women meant that women excelled in tasks associated with memory, interestingly, and even the ability to learn, where learning was associated with taming, that led to docility and pliability as well as mutability. In this way, women become auxiliary databases whose task is simply to reiterate and remember the work of others. She says, using lots of works by others to put together a paper. Anyway. In the wider de-skilling attached to female labour in systems of increasing automation, women become entirely interchangeable with the technical objects that facilitate their entry into the labour market. Kittler links sexual innovation with technical innovation via the shift from literary to informational culture in the 19th century, so that the typewriter can refer both to a typewriting machine and to the woman who types. He explains that this emerges at a time when the labour of writing shifted from being the work of professional male secretaries who wrote longhand to female workers who transcribed on keyboards. So that was the point at which it shifts from being male to female labour. Typists were reliant on manual dexterity rather than intellect or education, perpetuating the idea of women as kind of like robotic drones, I guess. During the First and Second World War, increasing numbers of women were employed as computers to work on a range of ballistics and military communication problems, including the calculation of firing tables, and Sadie Plant has written really interestingly about that. Plant reminds us that the women deployed to compute missile trajectories would soon be employed to assemble components of electronic computers to do the task of computing in their place. So I don't know if any of you have seen the film Hidden Figures, but yeah, so there are recent kinds of ways in which these stories are beginning to emerge into the kind of popular consciousness. Automated systems could dispense with women's contributions in the field of programming, computer programming, because they too relied on sets of rules that made women external memory devices utilized in the service of the computer. Daston writes in her work about calculation, about how calculation moves from being initially a task that's equated with a certain degree of intellectual skill and capability, and as it's mechanized becomes increasingly de-skilled, mechanical, anybody can do it, just put them in front of a machine. And I think it's interesting, maybe we'll touch on later, to think about how calculation is again changing in the kind of post-digital context, or what it means, and whether calculation is different from computation. Anyway, that's another day, perhaps. So, Daston writes that as calculation became increasingly mechanized and automated, it was stripped of its association with intelligence. That gender was essentialized by 19th century natural sciences had a lasting legacy. I'm sure we all realize that. Even recent theorists of agency, such as Bruno Latour, still insist upon feminizing ecology, as though this basic authorial subjection is not significant in understanding the politics of agency and power. To speak of nature and woman as repositories of pre-cultural or natural signification is to rely on a materialist obfuscation, where concepts are separated from the cultural inscriptions that formulate them. Euphonia heralds the text-to-speech function of this computer, as we heard at the beginning, where recordings of human speech are sliced into constituent parts and reassembled as an automatic reading function. But there had been much earlier attempts to create speaking machines before Faber. In 1791, Wolfgang von Kepler's less uncanny actually, I should have put a slide in, I've just realised, which I forgot, so I'm sorry about that. Machine, so it just looked literally like a machine. It didn't have any kind of human-like qualities. Would manage to utter a series of phrases, amongst them, "You are my friend, I love you with all my heart." And it's really interesting the way that love performs this kind of complication, I suppose, in the idea of what should constitute a non-human or a human subject. So we see that in lots of recent cinematic examples, Ex Machina, Her, and so forth. Like nature and woman, love can also be a contingent signifier used to evoke the pre-cultural. For Kittler, the terms woman, love, and nature become contentiously synonymous. And he's talking about literature, particularly in literature of the 19th century. Love poetry and romantic fiction are didactic tools that teach young women to internalize and repeat the codes and conducts of modern love, using their innate skills of imitation and repetition, which we've already discussed. That these terms were synonymous lends weight to the idea that love's function became exempt from all other social, material, or economic causal factors. Also wanted to mention Nicholas Luhmann's writing on Nicholas Luhmann writes about systems theory, and he wrote a really interesting book about love as a system of communication and codification. And what's really interesting about his conceptualization of love is that it's a system of, he sees it as a system of communication which relies on the least amount of communication possible. So too much communication means something is going wrong with this system, right? But he also sees that it's kind of having chance. So the love relationship in modern romantic fiction becomes, or the prelude, if you like, of love becomes chance, the chance encounter. And then there's this kind of usually a series of events where things seem increasingly predestined or predetermined. And I've written about love in relation to the probability calculus in that respect. But I think what's interesting about the fact that love becomes based upon chance is that it helps to democratize the idea of love through the increasingly sort of literate European societies, because it's not attached to any other kind of association or social system, if you like. So love, he sees that love becomes completely autonomous as a system of communication. You know, it's a law unto itself. It has a particular kind of sovereignty. Anyway, yes. Yeah, so because love's logic is seen to become increasingly self-authenticating in increasingly complex modern social systems, it's no longer reliant upon existing social relations or bonds to authenticate it. If its prelude was chance, then the significance of the love relationship became absolute and of itself. Luhmann explains that love could help foreground the individual against a psychic landscape that had subsumed all other aspects of the environment into itself. I think that's just such a fantastically evocative and powerful idea. The unique selection and attributes of the beloved supported the idea of individualism above all other concerns, and this becomes a defining feature of westernized democracies in the global north, so this kind of heightened individualism, as we all know. Such an individual agency assumes agency not only over their immediate environment, but this naturalizes the appropriation of lands, in general reduced to this kind of psychic contour, in the project of colonization. In these terms, the privileging of the individual over the environment powerfully reinforces borders of a physical, geographical kind as we see in the interrelatedness of the family and the nation state. After all, love's early modern objective was to establish the family as a module or unit whose collective form for Hannah Arendt was called the nation. In this way, we see that love is already performing numerous functions that automatically unfold as natural aspects of its event. So I probably should have qualified at the beginning. I'm talking about modern romantic love, in case it seems that I'm just talking about a sort of generalized notion of love. So the reproductive and distributive capacities of technology such as the printing press not only infer love's program, but can also refer to love as a form of labour, harmonious with industrial production. Indeed, Goethe's Faust exemplifies love and woman as the repositories of authenticity that must remain unconscious of their part in the system of their own value, in the creation of their own value. And I just wanted to read a little bit of Goethe's Faust for you to demonstrate what I'm talking about in the paper, so I'll try. That's that singleness of heart and absence of all artifice, gifts as they are above all price, heaven's holiest blessing should be thus of their own worth unconscious. Almost got that. That meekness, gentleness, and treasure which nature, who doth still impart to all in love and lavish measure, gives to the child whom she loves dearest. The heart's course represents everything that's aligned with authenticity. Love's traits must necessarily be unconscious of their own worth, giving rise to features associated with acquiescence, meekness, and gentleness, and endorsed by a feminized nature or idea of nature. We've already considered the modern meaning of automatic as that which is unconscious and necessary. Faust claims that love and woman, in remaining unconscious, must remain unconscious of their value in order perhaps to function naturally or according to the logic of male authors. In this manner, they also retain their affinity with automatic processes that are both unconscious and necessary to the project of patriarchal interest. Evoking the erotic love of Goethe's Faust, Marx claimed that the capitalist transferal of living labour into lifeless objects is a process whereby an animate monster works as if its body were by love possessed. Matter, otherwise inert, is gripped by a monstrous potential akin to the bodily effects of romantic love. In describing objects possessed with vitality, love is linked with autonomous functions that are the animate forces of life itself. Capitalism has long aspired to harness these autonomous flows and bodily vitality. The throb and circulation of capitalist production has no organ other than the worker's own heart, and this heartbeat, claimed Marx, is appropriated by the machines of capitalist production. How are we doing for time? Is it okay? Yeah, okay. Okay. Unlike the body made seamlessly animate and the continuous flow and pulse of commodities imagined by the president of Goodyear Tires, which we looked at earlier, automation here is a possession, a colonization linked to the effects of romantic love. I also wanted to mention Max Weber's work, where love is a form of irrationality that rationalizes labor and the world of work in industrial capitalist systems. So love and eroticism are elevated to a realm of sublime conscious enjoyment, he claims, removed as far as possible from rationality and appearing like a gateway into the most irrational and thereby real, this is his own words, kernel of life as compared with the mechanisms of rationality. This limitless giving of the self associated with love is radically opposed to functionality, rationality, and generality, and imparted, he says, the unique meaning of a specific other. The lover realizes himself to be rooted in the kernel of the truly living, which is eternally inaccessible to any rational endeavor. He allows himself to be freed from the cold skeletal hands of rational orders just as completely as from the banality of everyday routine. While seeming to pitch itself against functionality, work, and mechanism, love perhaps obfuscates its own repetitious social program, seeming to happen naturally and naturalizing its own labors, which are seen to be acts of love. Here I want to suggest that love not only makes the world of repetitious modern industrial labor tolerable, but it provides modern romantic society with a prototypical system of automation that works to suppress all other forms of causality, whether they're economic or self-interest, exploitative, altruistic, or whatever. So I'm just going to say a few things about the family, and then I'm going to move on to the more contemporary, some contemporary examples. So nearly there. Okay. So modern society was, as I've suggested, ideally comprised of individual family units, constellations that for Hannah Arendt were economically organized into the facsimile of one superhuman family whose political form of organization is called the nation. The borders of the nation state, love of the nation, and obligations to one's own make inequalities of labor and geography seem natural. Love is used to naturalize unequal relations not only between couples, but between people and states. In this case, it can facilitate and even justify inequality and eventually assure the smooth functioning of Western corporate power. It's really interesting as well how the term corporation, the Latin root, means to form into a body, which I think is a really interesting aside. Anyway, while romantic love has long occupied the position of unquestioned sovereignty, its capacity to initiate hierarchies that render some excremental and dispensable demonstrates its limits in providing an adequate basis for ethics or morality in a global milieu. Helen Hester claims that we're witnessing the protocols of femininity being programmed into machines. Oh yeah, I've just got one more. As feminized labor becomes technologized labor. We have seen that the protocols of femininity have long been associated, I use femininity always with these, have long been associated with the operation of and automation of systems, that these protocols already facilitate and program machines and systems of automation as part of the project of an identity that can be considered feminine. She's right to note that such relationships are highlighted and made explicit by digital technologies. Post-digital systems make manifest many of the discrete features of binary logic that sustained the 19th and early 20th centuries. Love and subjectivity are shown to be constructs, works in progress, divested of essence and no longer markers of stability. Nature is reconfigured through understanding the complex intersections of agency and materiality that constitute humans as technical systems. If the automatic of the 19th and 20th centuries was tethered to the unconscious and the necessary, we might posit that today the automatic is associated with systems that borrow the tenets of the unconscious to make the world into a system of reflexes that better serve the economy. After all, there are degrees of unconsciousness, and this is a really interesting thing which Catherine Hales talks about, where she writes about the non-conscious, which I think is so rich and interesting. So between this kind of binarized modern notion of the conscious and the unconscious, she posits the non-conscious, and that there are degrees of kind of consciousness and non-consciousness. There aren't just these two discrete states. The digital economy reiterates geographical, class-based and racial borders that separate those who have access to digital forms of automation and those whose bodies automate the production lines that make them. Although we may well be aware of such practices, the bodies that are put to work within such systems become automatic in every sense of the word. That is, they are the unconscious but necessary features of global capital whose subjection is the true face of a deeply embedded nationalistic love of the one at the expense of all others. Today, automatic systems increasingly aspire to the artificial semblance of intelligence. And I wanted to momentarily talk about these real dolls, which are being marketed as potentially artificially intelligent sex dolls. Because in a way, they reminded me of euphonia. I mean, I know that they have a completely sort of different function, but they also very similar, you know. They have these very kind of basic, the very basic capacity to make these kind of crude sentences and say stuff like, I don't want to go to the mall, and, you know, you look nice today. And I think it's really interesting, you know, when you read about these real dolls, the attention to detail in the face of these bots and people who are carefully crafting the eyes and different features to make them increasingly lifelike. Yeah. I think so far she can only move her neck. She can't move, the rest of her body is completely inert, and I guess, you know, it doesn't actually need to kind of function in any other way necessarily. But there's this, like, she moves her, you know, she can move her neck from side to side, and she can speak, and her eyes are really realistic, because it's very important, you know, when you're looking into the eyes of the other, that you feel some kind of connection. And I was thinking it's very interesting, this need for a realistic object that's like, you know, that borrows certain tropes associated with being a woman, and tries to kind of somehow mask the kind of the mechanism, I suppose. If we think about, you know, female sex toys, there's never really been an equivalent. They've always just been a complete abstraction, and that's been fine. But so what is it, you know, why is there this desire, this drive to actually give these mechanisms this face? And I was thinking about euphonia as well, and the uncanniness of this face attached to this speaking machine that doesn't really essentially need a face. Anyway, so I think also there's a hope that the real dolls will have AI, they'll be networked, you know, so you can, and they'll have sort of access. In one of the interviews I read with the people who are making them, they'll have access to Wikipedia, so they'll have like a broader knowledge base, and I guess they can search Wikipedia, so you don't have to, I don't know. But anyway, just the strangeness, the oddness, and this kind of the relationship between these uncanny technical devices. So there's obviously some concern about these automata and the objectification of women. That's very obvious and apparent. But more terrifying, perhaps, is the realism that these dolls make a claim upon. Their artificiality is somehow less worrying than the humans behind them who try to appeal to some kind of natural impulse. And yeah, I didn't really have time to explore that so much, but I want to end with a quote from Catherine Hales, who claims that the continuing force of gender hierarchies do not disappear as possessive individualism collapses, but rather continue to operate differently. What has changed is not the historical power of difference between genders, but the distribution of subjectivities in relation to the regime of computation. And that's it. So if you have any questions, I'd be really happy to answer. sorry, I tried to compress, it's one of these things where you start reading about it thinking, I've got this really simple idea about, researching automation, and then it's such a kind of massive and interesting field. So I apologise if it was kind of a bit enormous in what it tried to incorporate. But anyway, any questions or points or yeah? Oh,
Hi. So I don't want to totally co-opt it towards the end about the sex thing, but I thought it was sort of interesting that you were saying female sex toys were abstracted. And did you mean like dildos? Is that,
yes.
And you mean abstracted in the sense that they're disembodied, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would like to say, first of all, females aren't the only ones that use dildos, but I think that perhaps the male equivalent or something like that, or would be sort of like the fleshlight, and so then you have to sort of say that you have the dildo and the fleshlight, and then the thing that's missing then is an active male sex doll, and then which made me sort of come full circle here and thinking about how that's that sort of activity versus passivity would be sort of like the automation, and so if you would almost link automation with activity and passivity with a static female sex doll. So I was sort of thinking that what the missing link is sort of like an automated male sex doll. But I don't know. That's sort of the logical circle I ran in there.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts about that. I think in some of the articles I've read about the real doll, there is a kind of suggestion that there won't only be dolls, but there'll be abstract objects, which could also provide the same kinds of functions. And I think, there's something quite interesting about that. Maybe more interesting, in a sense, than, resorting to this kind of terrible trope, I suppose. Yeah, I don't know what's... I'm not an expert on sex toys. I've totally got to fess up to that. Should I edit this out? I don't really know about it. I won't say anything else in case it's too embarrassing. Anything else? Is it helpful to, I have some questions for you guys, is it helpful to have all this kind of historical stuff? Yeah, because I suppose when I'm writing, a lot of it's written sort of in the 90s and the early 2000s, and I think, oh my God, does everybody already know this, or it's so passé? But I think it's good, it seems very timely to, bring it back to life at this present kind of political moment as well. But that's good. Were you going to say something? Any other thoughts about love? It maybe came across very negatively. I'm not trying to say that, love, no one should love. Love is really a terrible thing. I hope that didn't come across either. It's just maybe where, I don't know, relying on models that were very much part of a kind of process of, modern systems and their kind of binaries and so forth. And, I think also that love can be such a coverall for so many experiences or forms of exploitation and so forth and so on. So it's interesting to think about how it is evolving, it's always evolving, but...
So you kind of noted that all of the conclusions and the hypotheses you had about love were specifically about romantic love, but don't you think that a lot of those theses could also apply to this kind of naturalized or assumed love for children, to this kind of seemingly automatic love for children that then people use to excuse so many things?
Yeah, I think that I think there is a tendency to use love as a kind of, I don't know, a way of avoiding kind of agency, or can you give me an example?
Well, I'm just thinking like of, using this mask of love, or using the fact that somebody does love to like cover up for any kind of like embeddedness in systems of violence at all. So, or, kind of, I'm thinking of like the way that you kind of talked about like all these little like particles of love, like making this big like machine. And so thinking about just like everything from, when you talk about somebody enacting like being an agent of like the structural violence, it always goes back to like, I'm just doing it to feed my family, or I'm just doing it to like, the cop has kids or whatever, he loves his kids. So, something like that, like this kind of like, first of all, we don't even know that he loves his kids. Like, we didn't really ask, but like, it's kind of like this one assumed love, and two, like this kind of excuse for everything else.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I mean, you see it in these kind of small personal examples, or like you're saying, in the examples of love for a child, that becomes a kind of cover-all for all kinds of behaviours. And I think it's interesting how we assume love is good, automatically, that it's kind of beneficent and for the greater good, and for the best and so forth. When it doesn't take very much close. You don't have to get much closer to analysis of it in certain situations to see that it has many manifestations, and not all of them are positive. And I think even politically, love of the leader is also, a great kind of tool. It's a great kind of technique for manipulating, or for coercing, and so forth. So, I think.
I think it's also interesting. This is just what I would just say. So, to think of love as in terms of a script. So, like love, when we think about love, it's usually like scripted. This is what you do when you love someone. And then machines are often scripted as well, like the way they're designed. But often to see the user who's going to use the machine, it's really ambiguous how they're going to use the machine. So I think that's just like interesting to make the parallel between like the scripted love and the machine that's designed and has like a certain script, how it should be used.
What are you saying? Are you saying that what's your perspective on that?
I think that that the way we think about machines and the way we think about what love is, it's sort of like pre-given. And if you sort of like deviate from the way you practice or give your love as the way you operate the machines, it's all like viewed as not right, if it makes sense. I don't know, that's just something, maybe if you have something to say to that or not.
I'm so jet lagged that sometimes I just zone out, and I just need you to compress the question a little bit. Sorry.
I think like from the STS perspective, if you could say, like if you could be said that love is scripted as machine, or that there's some sort of like analogy between like what Latour and Arkrick are saying about script of the machine, and if that could be maybe applied to love. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think I tried to suggest that in the talk somehow, maybe a bit ambiguously, and maybe not as clearly as I hoped. But yeah, I think the idea of scripting is interesting. I think especially from a sort of the perspective of Luhmann and this kind of social system, and this kind of the way that intimacy is codified. I mean, for him, it's completely, it is a code, it is scripted, and yet each individual, or somebody put it really beautifully just now, I can't remember exactly what you said, but each constellation experiences it as though it's a very unique, and it seems to me really fascinating how this pattern is repeated, even if you become conscious of it, you're not necessarily not going to, have that kind of experience. So I think it's interesting in its scriptedness, that even though it's a bit like, I suppose, the kind of way we consider ourselves to be very individualistic, when actually we're probably much more alike and much more, functioning simultaneously. But in order for that to happen, it seems, this kind of idea that there's something unique about us has to be played out, and it makes it kind of more acceptable somehow that actually, we're a mass or a body or a... I hope that somehow answers.
Thanks, Lee. I was wondering if I was thinking about love. I suppose we can also kind of as a quick definition think of it as a kind of like an extra contractual form of trust, or something of like, which is some kind of trust that supersedes the contract, or is larger than something that can be reduced to contractual relations. It's something more. But then with AI, I wonder if you have given thought to the uncanny valley, but in relation to identification as the kind of basic contract, where
that's interesting.
Uncanny valley is so much about recognition, where what is it that you kind of start with the cutest and most benign form of AI, like R2-D2 in terms of aesthetics, right? Like a trash can kind of robot, which could only be, it's just that. But then you kind of move up, and as you become closer to the human, right before with uncanny valley for those. You can't just drop the term. So right before when you're approaching the human, before you get to someone who just looks perfectly human, you drop down into the uncanny valley. When you are in the kind of Siri or Alexa, even maybe a bit beyond Siri and Alexa, where you are, where you are human, but something is really wrong. I mean, something is just really uncanny, where I look like myself, except for just this, something is just slightly off, and it breaks the whole contract.
That's interesting. How does that relate to trust, though? What are you? Yeah, I don't quite understand how that relates. Can you explain it?
It's an interesting figure because it breaks it sort of confuses the binary between self and other and artificial and natural, where it's actually something sort of collapses when you get really close to the real thing. But when you, of course, when you have some kind of singularity style AI, you're, something that passes the Turing test is basically human for all intents and purposes. It has crossed the boundary. But then right before that, it's when it appears most diabolical. It's like it's just there, but not quite.
Yeah, I feel like some of my boyfriends could really identify with that. Yes, definitely. The uncanny valley. I actually don't know what else to say about that. But it's good. I'm going to think more on it.
So I find it very interesting, you talking about typewriters as typists and then the actual machine of, I just wonder how much you equate the capitalist system into like forcing almost the automation of love, in that capitalism wants us to isolate ourselves into small groups so that we must make a living to support that small group. And I just wonder how much the newer forms of relationships like polyamory or what I've been calling socialized love, kind of complicates that system. And if there is a way to de-automatize, is there a word? Is that a word?
I know what you mean.
Whatever the reverse of like making something automatic would be, how much those social systems complicate capitalism in that. Well, you know what do you know what I'm getting at in that way? I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. I mean, that's the question, I guess. What are the alternatives, or how do we uncouple from this system, in a sense? And of course, if we had the answer to that, I guess we'd all be out there doing it. But I think what's interesting is, this kind of last, 40 years has just been such a kind of period of radical change. And I always keep coming back to this kind of the context of the post-digital and how we're still trying to force these modern tropes into this completely different system that doesn't really suit these models or these units or these modules anymore. And I think, we need new forms of organization, generally, like politically, personally, geographically. And I don't know how those things look, or, what they how they should be functioning, but it's almost like we need to catch up with the capacity of this, of the kind of structure of the system that we're in.
I guess I need to simplify the question in that. What I'm really asking is the socialization of these systems by de-individualizing love, and I guess, does that seem like a logical step to take in terms of, I guess, reclaiming ourselves as organic beings rather than automatons or automatons? Thank you.
I don't know, because I don't make that distinction between the organic and the automated or mechanical necessarily, because then we just then return to a kind of binarized set of conditions. I think, ideas of love need to be, I don't know, somehow, not just ideas of love, but ideas of agency need to help us to, be responsible for our own violence, the violence that we are all participating in all of the time, and that goes on and that somehow is allowed to go on, because it's too too complex to change it, or it would mean we would have to radically alter our lives and live in different ways. And but it just seems to me that this kind of idea of modern romantic love is like we're dragging it along like this kind of the last vestiges of this kind of modern industrial period. And there are lots of writers who write, who talk about the fact that modernism, in the modern period, even though it tried really hard to disassociate itself from romanticism and the kind of romantic period that preceded it, really perpetuated a kind of modern romantic subjectivity. And I think it's something which we need to kind of, I don't know how we can do it, or I don't know what the answer is, but somehow maybe just being aware, being aware of the kinds of obfuscation that we facilitate in our kind of local behaviours, if you like. Not to sort of, I don't know, be trying to solve everything all at the same time. But you know what I mean? It just feels like the way we live needs to kind of match the capacity that the system now has, but it isn't, I guess. Eventually it will have to, I think. Anything else?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.